Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode, so to speak, of our webinar of Speaking of Oats. My name is Tom Rebay. I'm the chair of the board of Oat Global. Oat Global is a public-private relationship partnership that's committed to improving science, resiliency, quality, and value of oats at a global scale. Today's webinar will feature an update from from two organizations, the North American Milling Association and the Canadian National Millers Association. Will give us an update on oats and their perspective on what's going on from regulatory and other areas that affect the milling industry in particular. Just as a little bit more background too, that the webinar is hosted by the University of Minnesota, the Oat Global organization, and along with Charlene White from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, located in Ottawa. And I want to thank them too for their for organizing and getting this event off the ground as well. Please use the chat function if you have any types of comments, but then also use the Q&A function located at the bottom of the Zoom browser there to place your questions in there. Charlene and Jim will keep an eye on the questions, and we'll convey those to the moderators to get or to the panelists to get questions answered. So why don't I go ahead and turn over to Dale Nellor from North American Milling Association and Gordon Harrison from Canadian National Oat Millers or National Milling Association, and they will begin with the update.
Okay. That work?
Yep, that looks real good.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity, the invitation. This is my first engagement with Oat Global, and grateful to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. And that slide presentation is frozen. Just a second. Unbelievable. Sorry. We'll try a different one, sorry. Okay, hope that works. Topics for today. So we're a national association. A few words about us, what our members expect from us, what government expects from us, because a lot of what we do is engagement with government, what we actually do and how long it takes. That topic is in deference to many of the individuals who are on the webinar who are in the world of research, and I'm going to try and provide some examples of how research leads to better regulation and a few comments what might head in the next 30 years. So our association turned 100 this year, 100 years of age, founded in 1920. It's a federally chartered, it's a national not-for-profit corporation. Membership in the CNMA is voluntary. We have both wheat and oat milling member categories. And the thrust of what we do is we represent the public policy and regulatory interests of our members. The president, myself, I'm a registered lobbyist as they are defined in Canada under Canadian law. So our members, primary processors, are the first step in the processing of grains into food ingredients and further processed foods. We like to think in terms of that being the vital link between grain producers and consumers. Of course, there are others in the supply chain. We find ourselves right in the middle. And this graphic identifies and acknowledges other people at various points in the supply chain, but our members are indeed right in the middle. So what do our members expect from us? People belong to industry associations, corporations belong to industry associations to a large degree so that they can avoid surprises, fewer surprises. They expect associations to keep watch on public policy and regulatory developments, watch for the unexpected so it can become expected and prepared for or responded to. We do a lot of interpretation of laws and regulations and policies in our work, both for our members and for others. We try to do pathfinding to regulatory compliance and help our members find a way to achieve compliance. We try to intervene when we have an intervention from regulators, such as the Canadian Food Inspection Agency or Health Canada. Surprisingly, there are interventions that we've never seen before as a consequence of emerging food safety concerns. So we're always learning. And when I say intervening, we do just that. Our members expect us to advocate for science-based regulation that reflects the real-world operating conditions. They expect us to help reduce business risk, keep them connected to one another. Bottom point is extremely important. If you want to have a long life in an industry association profession, you got to get good weather for the annual golf tournament. That's another high priority. So what government expects from us? Government in Canada, Canadian regulators in particular, they expect in dealing with an industry association that we have a high density of representation. That is to say that our members represent a large portion of the industry that they're dealing with. They want to understand that we do in fact legitimately represent the industry. They expect us to keep an eye on policy and regulatory proposals. It's an obligation under Canada's federal regulatory policy is if you develop regulation or modify regulation, you have to go through a consultative process that meets not only our domestic requirements, but the WTO obligations of members. They expect us to do advocacy for science-based regulation. And they expect us, when we do that advocacy, to bring more and better information to the table. We endeavor to do that. They expect us to help them in getting our members' perspectives on critical success factors for growth and competitiveness, prosperity in our industry, because much of government work is about supporting the economy, and narrowing it down, much of government work is about supporting the agri-food sector and agribusiness in particular, the entire supply chain that I showed in that schematic a few minutes ago. And finally, government expects advice from us. They expect us to participate in policy forums and advisory committees. So we have been part of advisory committees on the development of regulation and policy for at least the past 30 years. And among them are advisory committees to the Canadian Grain Commission, to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and others. There's a lot of engagement, and it's a pleasure, and it is an opportunity. What we actually do is we do try to stay connected with government to try and anticipate business risk from regulatory change. We're looking at that all of the time. Canada is undergoing a great deal of regulatory modernization. And as mentioned, the departments and agencies responsible for those regulations are obligated to consult and extensively consult. We currently have a number of consultations from regulators, and this has been a constant activity for us for the past 8 years, a great deal that's been going on. We try to be a trusted, a go-to point of contact for government. That requires that we stay in touch and that we're accountable. We try to broker solutions and get involved when regulators intervene, and there are industry-wide consequences and implications. We do analysis, we identify information gaps, research concepts for more and better information in regulation and policy making. I highlight more and better information, and that's a phrase, a term that a friend at Carleton University drilled into me in his help to us, is that we really need to bring science to bear when we're obligated to do science-based regulation. We do some seed funding, some cost sharing and management of research projects that are in the realm of science, often assisted by real life scientists with specific expertise. And we try to build consensus and consult with our members, other associations, and communicate industry views. I'm going to give you a few quick examples of where we had to bring it more and better information, more science, uh, research-based information, and how long it took us. And I put these timeframes in recognition of how much patience people in the cereal breeding community have to have in order to do your work and do it well. So in the realm of mill sanitation, keeping oat mills and wheat mills clean, there was a long relied upon fumigant called methyl bromide. It was an ozone depleting substance. So an international treaty, multilateral treaty called the Montreal Protocol, deemed that we would all end the use of these things in manufacturing and other uses. So in that process, which dated to about 1995 or prior, we actually conducted research, identified information gaps. And by the time we went through the entire process, it was about an 18-year process, so that we had an outcome that our industry was able to adapt and exit the use of methyl bromide. This is an initiative that was shared in both Canada and the United States, but each of our associations worked on this independently with our members. Mycotoxins have been a major part of our work since 2008. Health Canada proposed in that year adoption of maximum limits for ochratoxin A, similar to those that were put into law in the European Union in 2006. We formed a working group under the Canada Grains Council. We had the best consultants we could find, toxicologists do a critical evaluation of the risk assessment. Then we designed and executed a 3-year study of the incidence and levels in both oats and wheat. And we looked at both OTA and DON in that study. Around the same time, Canadian Food Inspection Agency initiated a multi-year study to get a better understanding of the incidence and levels of both OTA and DON in grain-based foods. All of this work revealed that we have generally low levels of ochratoxin A and of DON, and that the adoption of maximum limits would not add to food safety. It would not meaningfully reduce health risk. That was an 8-year process so far. Now in 2020, European Food Safety Authority issued a risk analysis that says we don't know enough about OTA. And of course, OTA is something that is important in the oat industry, domestically and in export markets. We anticipate keeping an eye on this for a lot of years to come. But what we've done is avoided having maximum limits that are damaging to the industry, impractical, and not based in science in the North American perspective. Another example in the realm of priority allergens. If you're a grain producer, you're doing crop rotations. And if you're a grain handler and marketer, you're doing a lot of handling of grains through the same facilities. So we do have an awful lot of adventitious presence, unintended, unavoidable presence of one commodity in another. This is true of wheat, it's true of oats, it's true of all commodities. So what we did in 2012, unlike the United States, we added mustard, the spice mustard, as a priority allergen as part of our allergen labeling regulation. In the United States, it's under FALCPA, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. So our problem with this was that the allergenic proteins in canola are identical to those in mustard varieties, and they're not distinguishable with commercially available ELISA tests in the grain industry. So the imposition of strict controls and levels on mustard had some problems for us. So we have done a 3-year study of incidence and levels in unprocessed wheat, for example. That was done with the assistance of the Canadian Grain Commission. And Health Canada, thankfully, launched a very good study of the incidence and levels of mustard in foods as compared with canola. So the ELISA results revealed a high incidence, and when they did some further work with a not commercially available reference lab methodology, they found it was really canola that we were finding. So as a consequence of this, we've been in dialogue with Health Canada about this challenge. It's a scientific challenge, it's a technological challenge. And as a backdrop to that, why we're doing it is that our precautionary labeling policy is still out of step with that of the United States under FALPA. We've done a lot of work on foodborne pathogens and preventive controls. We asked for the Safe Food Canadians Act, and we lobbied hard to have it in 2011, believe it or not, at a time when the Food Safety Modernization Act was being developed. And we did not emulate that. We worked from a Canadian perspective. And both the FSMA rules and the Safe Food for Canadian regulations require manufacturers to have preventive controls. So as a consequence, milled grain products and grain-based foods are receiving more attention. There are many unanswered questions about the source and the controls for foodborne pathogens. Fortunately, from an oat perspective, oat milling has some distinct advantages because of the use of steam and heat in some of the processes. And on the wheat side, individual milling companies are working very hard on proprietary processes to drastically reduce pathogen levels and bacterial loads in milled grain products. This look ahead is mine, it's not the association's, but I wanted to share it with you. So in my look ahead over the next 30 years, grain-based foods will continue to be staple foods, and the demand will be driven by population growth. In North America, we have a moderate population growth in recent years of about 0.5% to 1% annually. That probably isn't going to change very much. In addition to the population growth, consumer behavior might change, and it might increase per capita consumption by 0.5%, we'll call it that. I would expect a modest change in Canada's trade balance with the United States. We have long experience since 1992 in trading of grains and grain-based foods. There will be thousands of new and reformulated food products annually. Food safety will be a persistent regulatory and operational challenge. Mycotoxins will present new food safety concerns that will engage many researchers internationally in the realm of cereal breeding and other disciplines. Living human pathogens in grains and grain-based products will possibly be more prevalent, possibly more diverse. Milling technology is not likely to change very little other than for pathogen reductions and other food safety reasons. Finally, societal expectations for sustainability will dominate. This will affect inputs, good production and manufacturing practice, product formulation, packaging, recycling, and the overall perceived value of oat-based and other grain-based foods. Finally, I want to mention quickly some of the researchers who have helped bring more and better information in the realm in these disciplines. I've listed them for you there. I've discovered that Tom Whitaker, who had worked primarily in ochratoxin A, actually more recently published a paper that's quite relevant to oats that could be of interest. The folks at UNB Lincoln who are working on the food safety side have been very important. Likewise, in the allergen field, David Miller at Carleton University. And I must emphasize that we do have very good research scientists in our federal public service, in the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and in Health Canada, and in the Canadian Grain Commission. And all of these people, like many of the people who are on this call, have been very well connected with one another as the need and opportunity arose, and they continue to be that way. So I thought it important to acknowledge all of the help that we've had from the research community. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Gordon. If there's any questions, quick, or should we move to Dale? Well, looks.
There is one question that came in about the limits of toxin, Tom, in Canada, what the rates are. or what are they according to CFI and FAO? The
We're talking,
acceptable,
are we talking about ochratoxin A or DON or both?
it doesn't say in the question, it just says acceptable limit of toxin in oat grain according to CFI and FAO.
It's a complicated question, and I would be happy to answer it more completely by email following the event. But to put it rather simply, as a consequence of the research that I spoke of, we have not had to add new maximum limits for grain-based foods, and in fact for other foods, but we'll focus on oat-based and wheat-based foods. We have not had to add maximum limits because we found that the prevailing levels in the grain supply chain and foods were sufficiently low to not present a health risk. So we have a general maximum limit for contaminants in foods that's within the regulations. We have not found it necessary to regulate as heavily or as directly as Health Canada thought some years ago. Happily, the supply chain producer forward has been able to manage fusarium and penicillium and other toxigenic fungi so that we do not have to have strict maximum limits. We're always looking at it, however.
There's a second question there now too from Chris Green in the UK. Are you seeing any genetic differences with respect to resistance to mycotoxins?
This is not my field, but my answer very quickly to that would be that cereal breeders in Canada, and I'm assuming in other jurisdictions, certainly the United States, in recent years have made considerable progress in imparting fusarium resistance to cultivars. And this is relatively recent after the better part of 30 years of tremendous amount of investment and research in dealing with fusarium in cereal grains, dealing with storage fungi such as penicillium is a much more difficult thing. We're not even into the realm of examining how we use genetics to deal with that, to the best of my knowledge. It'd be very, very difficult for cereal breeders to impart resistance for such storage fungi.
There are a few studies I know of where people are trying to find resistance to fusarium, but yeah, it's a complicated story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's move on to Dale. Thank you very much, Gordon.
Thanks, Jim, and good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here with you all today. So I'm Dale Nellor. I'm the Vice President of Government and Technical Affairs for the North American Millers Association. I oversee all the regulatory and legislative activities for our association. Just a little background on NAMA. While we are only 22 years young, our history is much longer than that, similar to Gordon. The National Millers Federation, Corn Millers Association, and Oat Millers Association Protein Grains International came together to join NAMA about 22 years ago. But those organizations operated independently for decades before that. So we have a long storied history and tradition in our sectors. We have 38 milling member companies. So those are companies in the United States and Canada that take the grain and mill it into a variety of fabulous products. And then we have 18 associate members. And so those would be interests that are tied to our industry from a supply chain perspective or a supplier perspective that feel the industry is of importance and want to support the sector. We're the only organization in Washington, D.C. that's dedicated to the interest of milling in the United States. And so we're unique in that way that when it comes to milling specific issues, there is nobody else in DC that's typically talking about it. We do collaborate with a lot of our supply chain partners, and I'll go into that a little later. But at the end of the day, if it's something that's specific to the milling industry, we are the voice for the industry in town. And then lastly, our main functions are education and advocacy. We do that with congressional leaders, regulators, and administration officials for the government. So here is just a highlight of what we focus on at NAMA. Our strategic plan identifies 3 areas that drive our focus. First being food safety, second nutrition, and third supply chain. And as you can imagine, supply chain can be quite large, and a number of issues and topics can fall into that category, into that bucket. Some of the issues that we focus on, and this is not a complete list, this is just kind of a highlight of some of the areas that we spend a significant amount of our time. But food safety, FSMA implementation, as Gordon mentioned before, that's the Food Safety Modernization Act here in the United States. Things related to nutrition and dietary guidelines, production practices, sustainability, trade policy, transportation. So there's a variety of issues that we work on. Some of our key events that we, throughout the year, we start with our spring conference, typically in the spring. And a part of that, we have our oat milling conference. So that's a key part of that conference. In the spring, we have our annual board meeting, which is typically in the fall. We also have a corn dry milling conference in the summer, and then we also have a policy conference, and we hold that here in Washington, D.C. on an annual basis, and gives an opportunity for our members to come to town, meet their members of Congress, and tell their story, not only to congressional leaders, but administration officials as well. So the tagline that we like to use is the link between grain and goodness. As Gordon highlighted in his presentation, the milling sector is in the middle of the supply chain. We are smack dab in the middle. And so in a lot of ways, we are bridging the gap between our upstream partners and our downstream partners. And so it's important through that process that we bridge that gap and we bridge that supply chain through strong communication and collaboration. And so I've identified some of the areas that I'm going to talk a little bit about today and how we focus on those things, some topics that we focus on as well. So first and foremost, demand and expectations versus the reality and the capabilities. And what I mean by that is when you're talking about demand of the system, whether that's a customer, whether that's a consumer, doesn't always align with the reality of the supply chain and the capabilities that the supply chain can provide those demands. So there's a fair amount of conversation and discussion within the supply chain when a consumer really wants something, whether it's nutritional based, whether it's from a production practice standpoint, what does that ultimately mean? And is that desire, are those expectations achievable? And so as the miller being in the middle of the supply chain, we find ourselves having these conversations on both sides of the supply chain and talking through what is the reality of the supply chain, the capabilities of the supply chain, and also how we can innovate and move forward to ultimately meet some of those demands of the customers and the consumer. With each generation, and this is, I see it firsthand. So I grew up in a farm in Northeast Nebraska. My family still farms it. My brother farms it, has taken over for my father. But with each generation, consumers become that much more removed from agriculture and where their food comes from. And while I have a strong appreciation, I can already see in my young sons, because they're not on the farm, because they don't see it firsthand every day, they have a less of an understanding and appreciation of where their food comes from. Because, hey, Dad, I need cereal. Let's just go to the grocery store because that's where cereal comes from. And and as we continue to go generation to generation, as agriculture becomes more technology based and expands, that gap, to my concern, will continue to grow. So one of the things that we always like to focus on, no matter who we're talking about, is trying to connect those dots. And so it's always important for us here at NAMA to keep those line of communication open throughout the supply chain and through those that are impactful to the industry and sector. So moving on to our supply chain partners, a prime example that we do on a regular basis is trying to identify the needs and wants of the supply chain and how do we achieve those. And a good example of that, where we have worked in the oat space, is on research. Research has always been a priority for NAMA members in the milling sector. And how do we continue to advance and move the ball? And it's especially difficult when you're talking about a commodity that is such, especially in the United States, which is so small in scope and size compared to corn and soybeans, for example. So when it comes to prioritization within organizations in the United States or research bodies, sometimes it can be lost in the mix. So NAMA has always focused on supporting and advancing initiatives supporting oat research. And what it's always critical for us to do is, what is the research needed, not only for production, but for milling quality and consumer demand? Because at the end of the day, those three components are always important to the end product. Another example of where we work in this space is recently we submitted comments regarding the use of organics and the certification process, and to help improve the enforcement of that. And for our members, it was important to weigh in and provide our perspective to that process, because, for example, one of the areas that they were talking about in making the enforcement of organic standards stronger was they were using the same metrics, the same methodology in the transportation side for ocean freight versus trucking. So those of my colleagues across the border in Canada, as you can imagine, trucks move a lot quicker from point A to point B than it would when you're using ocean freight. So we submitted comments based on feedback from our milling members, from our supply chain partners, on what that ultimately would mean to our sector and the importance of our sector. And in that vein, when we're talking about our supply chain partners, we always want to be supportive of the folks either upstream or downstream, because what may not be a pressure point for us in the milling sector in the middle may be a pressure point for the producer community or for our ultimate customers. And at the end of the day, if those pressure points are too great, that ultimately hinders our supply chain. So another good example of areas that we work collaboratively together is on issues related to trade. We spend a fair amount of time working on issues related to codex, keeping an eye on the conversations around the world, as Gordon alluded to maximum limits, residue standards for small grains, because we know anytime you are potentially hindering the flow of commodities or products, that ultimately is a detriment to the sector and the industry. So when it comes to our supply chain partners, we are always working with them to try to find common ground, to collaborate where we can, to provide a unified, strong voice, as I'll talk here in a few minutes, with our congressional leaders and folks within the regulatory body and administration. And not only are we talking with our, what I would call immediate supply chain partners, but we also, Gordon, for example, is a prime example of a colleague in Canada that we work with on a regular basis, compare notes, talk about similar challenges. But we at NAMA, we also work with our counterparts in the EU and try to keep in contact and share notes when appropriate. Moving on to the next area that we focus on quite a bit is congressional leadership. We at NAMA, supporting our members from a variety of commodity classes, we have a fairly wide footprint in our congressional body. And so, as Gordon had alluded to earlier, it's important to continue to have line of communication and build relationships. Because while you may not have an issue today, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, you might. And at the end of the day, when it comes to government bodies, relationships are important. And what I would say is what we have been dealing with in 2020 is a prime example of why those relationships are important. COVID-19, I think, sidelined and blindsided most everybody globally. And so if you would have asked me what our priorities were, what we were going to focus on in January or February this year, are completely different than what we ultimately focused on and spent a lot of our time on in 2020. While we continue to advance the issues of importance to our membership, we spent a significant amount of time on the COVID-19 pandemic and ensuring that we continue to be able to not only bring commodities into our facilities to keep them flowing, how do our facilities manage their workforce so they can continue to operate safely, and then lastly, get their products to the end consumer. And so we've spent a lot of time since March working with our congressional leaders, our regulatory leaders, to help in a lot of ways ensure that they understand how the milling process works, how the supply chain operates, so that whatever restrictions, guidelines they put in place, it takes into account what is going on within the milling supply chain, so we can limit the amount of disruption in this unprecedented time. And so from a congressional standpoint, the relationships that we continue to foster, build, and have had for several years, we continue to work on those. And the Agriculture Committee in both the House and the Senate, as well as Appropriation, are the two committees of jurisdiction we work with the most. They cover the policy side as well as the funding side from a government standpoint. So again, it goes back to the food safety issues, research issues, nutrition, policy. As I mentioned before, the oat research work that we have been supportive of through USDA ARS, there is funding components of that. So we work with our congressional leaders to support that funding. And we work in a variety of ways. So first we identify the congressional districts where our members have facilities. Then it's where the commodity is being grown. So for oat, for example, what states, what congressional districts are those being grown? And so then that's how we build our coalition of support. We provide them information about what we're trying to accomplish with our research objectives, who it will impact, who it will support from a producer standpoint, from a production standpoint, and ultimately for the consumer, for a higher quality product, for a more consistent product to meet that ultimate consumer demand. So those are areas that we focus on significantly. Within the Ag Committee, we're going to have the Farm Bill coming up in a couple years. So the Ag Committee will begin doing hearings and listening sessions. So one of the things that will be key for us is not only within the NAMA membership, but also within our supply chain partners, what are key policy initiatives and actions we will be wanting to take within the Farm Bill. So when new farm policy is being written, how can we play a proactive role in that process? So that is a process that happens every 5 years. But annually, we have the appropriation process, which is funding. So again, that's a constant communication level. We're speaking to our research partners within the system about what they're working on, so we can take that back to congressional leaders and share with them the good work that's being done, that's ultimately being supportive of the industry. Other areas that we focus, transportation, trade, environment, those are all areas that we continue to engage those congressional leaders. And then lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the administration and regulatory side. Again, it's building those relationships, having those conversations. We've spent a significant amount of time the past several years on the topic of food safety and the implementation of FSMA, working with regulators, again, to understand the system, knowing that the milling sector, the commodity sector is different from, say, leafy greens, and the differences and the challenges of potentially having a same system. And then we work with regulatory bodies such as the Association for American Feed Controller Officials. This is a group that does a lot with animal feed. And a couple of years ago, we worked within that organization on a definition for oat fiber. And so, again, it goes back to wherever we can make an impact, support the industry, support our membership. That is a focus of NAMA. So for those of you in the United States, you know very well the dynamic we've been dealing with politically the past several months, and we'd had an election just weeks ago, and we're going to be having a transition of power within the administration. And again, this goes back to relationship building. You're probably going to be sick of that and that comment after today, but it's so important. It's so key, because as the current administration leaves and the new administration comes in, we will see a change of people and policy. And a lot of the people that will come in with the new administration are coming from industry, are coming from Congress. And so you will find that relationships that you have been building for the past several years with either a member of Congress or a staff now find themselves in a leadership role within the administration. And so that's why we continue to push for building those relationships, maintaining those relationships here in Washington, so we can hit the ground running. And we also have folks within the new administration that understand our industry, because there will be change. We just, in the end of the campaign, in these first weeks of the transition, climate and nutrition from an agriculture perspective are two areas that are talked about and a point of focus. So those are going to be areas that, while we will probably be spending more time on here in the next coming years with this new administration. And then lastly, not only are we having strong relationships with our administration officials, but we also work with the embassies here in Washington as well. The Canadian embassy is one that we stay in close contact with and have a regular dialogue, whether it's trade related or even policy related here in Washington for agriculture. So that's just kind of a highlight of some of the things that we're focusing on here at NAMA, how we navigate our partnerships, and the different relationships that we look to strive to have here in the United States. And with that, happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much to both of you, Dale and Gord. And I'm quite impressed with all the files that you people have to juggle all the time. That's a huge amount of work, keeping all those balls in the air and looking at all those things. Actually, Nick Tinker just popped up a question here. In a nutshell, how and how much are Canada and Mexico represented in NAMA?
So that's kind of a tricky question. And I say that because while some of the facilities in Canada and Mexico are not specifically represented within NAMA, our member companies have facilities in Canada and Mexico. So from a percentage standpoint, from a dues paying standpoint, it's relatively small, but many of our members have footprints in both Canada and Mexico.
Thanks. I actually have a question as well. You were saying, I know both of you referred to speaking with people in the EU and so on, and Dale, you were mentioning talking to the embassy people and so on as well. Do you connect often with other milling industry associations around the world, say Russia, South America, Australia, China, groups like this? Is there ever any way to bring people together to discuss these issues? Would that help anybody? Either of you could answer that question.
I think increased communication is always helpful and beneficial because at the end of the day, we become more globally connected. And so things that are impacting one part of the globe ultimately will reach wherever you happen to land. Obviously, our closest partners we talk to on a more regular basis. There are other organizations that have more of a global reach from the milling standpoint. But I do think that there's always room for increased communication and collaboration.
Great, thank you. By the way, today is International World Grain Day. So happy International World Grain Day to everybody today.
Well chosen.
Sorry, I got that wrong. Whole Grain Day, International Whole Grain Day.
If you don't have another question at the moment.
No, go ahead.
I'm grateful for Dale touching on the dietary recommendations and nutrition policy considerations. So many formulated food products contain milled grain products, oat and wheat and other. And many new products are coming annually. They're very diverse. So many of these formulated products are significantly sweetened, or they have significant salt content, or they have added fats, etc. And Canada, in particular, is busy, and at NAMA as well, but we're busy trying to defend the generic brand equity, the value of grain-based foods in the face of new initiatives to label foods differently and to put more information on the front of food packages, precautionary in nature, to highlight that these nutritionally dense foods are just that, nutritionally dense. And this is a global phenomenon. The UK has done this. South American countries have done this. It's called front of pack labeling. There's a committee at Codex Alimentaria studying front of pack labeling merits and attributes and precedents around the world. But after decades of attempting, among many food industry associations in Canada, did not fall into the trap of identifying foods and labeling them as good or bad. We're at the edge of that cliff now in Canada. And this is problematic for grain-based foods because the ingredients are prevalent, they're nutritionally dense foods, Breakfast cereals are a case in point. Bakery products are affected. Cookies, biscuits, nutritious portable snacks like granola bars. Many of these foods will be labeled differently. The latest country to do this happens to be Mexico. We were not aware that it was coming. And this work that has been done, particularly by NAMA, and in Canada, we have not led in this domain. We've worked with others, but maintaining the brand equity, the nutritional importance, the recognition of that nutritional importance in the eyes of government has been so important. And I thank Dale for including that in his presentation.
Right, we do have a couple of more questions now. Chris again asks, what do you see on the horizon is the biggest regulatory challenge facing oats? Again, either of you or both of you.
I think I just spoke of it. The biggest regulatory challenge in the near term is trying to not have grain-based foods misrepresented as being in any way unhealthy for normal dietary patterns, and to continue to present grain-based foods, including oat-based foods, as essential and part of a proper and balanced diet. And in the case of jurisdictions that have school meal programs, it's extremely important that these are included. The challenge has been for 20 some years to try to counter with meaningful science-based information the unfounded criticism of grain-based foods that we've seen. And I think that's the biggest challenge in the near term. In the medium term or longer term, as we learn more and more about human physiology and cell biology and what is potentially contributing to adverse health outcomes, mycotoxins will be in view for years and years to come. There's a number of them, and the field of concern seems to get broader every 5 years or so. So this industry is going to be very challenged to keep pace with the toxicology and other health sciences around contaminants in foods, grain-based foods in particular, because they're easily detected, they're prevalent, and they're easily quantified, and science is making it easier and easier to investigate these matters, which is why I mentioned the European Food Safety Authority risk assessment, which is recent. It was in March of this year, published more broadly in July. These are extremely complex issues, and for people whose focus is on manufacturing food, converting grains into foods that are wholesome, nutritious, and available, this is extremely important, and it's even more so in countries and jurisdictions that are more highly dependent on grain-based foods. Extremely difficult challenge, and it moves at glacial speed, it seems at times, but it'll be with us for a long time to come.
Yeah, I would agree with Gordon's points that he made, and it's really kind of the global landscape and the difference of opinion specifically to standards for mycotoxins, residues, etc. And Gordon alluded to it, as technology gets more refined, more advanced, detection becomes greater. And you know, we've seen that in some cases where we see a higher level of detection, and so the ultimate view is, oh my gosh, what's happened? Why has it all of a sudden gotten worse? Which in reality, it probably hasn't gotten worse. In fact, it's gotten better. It's just the detection has gotten better, and we have a better sense of what's out there, etc. So that's going to continue to be a challenge. To Gordon's point, not only for oat, but the entire milled grain sector.
Great. And yeah, Isabel had a similar question. I guess that's been answered now. Monica, I think I always mispronounce your name, Monica. Matthias, I'm sorry. Do you have data of mycotoxin negative impact in oats food chain? So what type of negative impacts are mycotoxins having on the food chain?
In oats, I think,
Yeah.
if I may, Dale, I'll jump in there.
Sure.
Fortunately, this applies to both oats and wheat, but it applies particularly to oats, is that Canada has been looking at mycotoxins in export cargoes for a long, long time. The Canadian Grain Commission had been doing sampling and monitoring and gathering data for many years before we started considering maximum limits for ochratoxin A and different maximum limits for DON. So we had a federal regulator, a regulator for the grains sector, with a great deal of information. And as we started looking at incidence and levels in grains destined for food use and in foods in Canada, we had a good starting point, thanks to the Canadian Grain Commission. So we do have data. We do have a study that was conducted that we managed, in fact, on behalf of the Canada Grains Council, that verified that oats and wheat in Canada have very low levels of OTA and DON. Fortunately, our Canadian Food Inspection Agency went beyond that and did a multi-year study of the levels of DON and OTA in foods. The data has been summarized and published in peer-reviewed papers by CFIA scientists, 2 of whom are mentioned in the last slide that I presented. And this data corroborates that in the foods as eaten by Canadian consumers, as exported to the United States and other countries, we have very low levels. There was a great deal of data, but if we rewind 12 years, we had practically none other than the Grain Commission data.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? We are pretty close to 12, well, my time anyway. Monica, who actually asked the last question, she'll actually be speaking at the next Sue webinar. So I see Jim put a little plug for that in the chat. We'll be on December 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern time again. There'll be more about that in the newsletter, things coming up from Oat Global and so on. Pat, you are here also representing Oat Global. Was there anything you wanted to add to the conversation?
No, I just wanted to thank, both our speakers today for giving us an update on some of the challenges you're facing and how you're collaborating with them. And I think we forget sometimes that some of the dietary fads, like all carbs is bad, how that actually relates into, our grain industry, and that we can easily knock out very healthy natural foods for a base misunderstanding or dietary preference. And so I appreciate you coming in and talking about that, and also how you're facing other hurdles regarding toxins as well as sustainable production, because that is definitely on the front mind of everybody right now.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yep, appreciate the opportunity.